Welcome to At Least You Heard It Here, with your host, former federal prosecutor, Alyse Adamson. Take it away, Alyse.
Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a missing Maryland man or a violent MS-13 gang member? Regardless of the narrative framing that you prefer, one thing is for certain, and that is Mr. Abrego Garcia is now back in the United States facing criminal charges. And welcome to another episode of At Least You Heard It Here. I'm your host, Alyse Adamson, and this is the podcast where we put the topic of the day on trial. And today's topic is this due process. So for those of you who don't know, Kilmar Abrego Garcia is a Maryland man, and yes, I say very intentionally he's a Maryland man because he was a man living and working in the state of Maryland when in mid-March, the government arrested him and then deported him to El Salvador, where he was originally in the dangerous El Salvadoran prison known as CCOT, and later, after lots of international pressure, was transferred to a lesser prison in El Salvador. But here's the thing to understand about Mr. Abrego Garcia. In 2019, Mr. Garcia was brought in front of an immigration judge where he was issued a withholding of removal to El Salvador. That, my friends, is a fact. A judge heard, and mind you, 2 times prior, Mr. Garcia was in front of a judge where the government made allegations that he was an MS-13 gang member. That is also true. But the judge found that there was credible fear for him to be deported back to his home country. And again, it is a fact that Mr. Garcia is an El Salvadoran national, that he couldn't be deported there. Now, that doesn't mean that he couldn't be deported. He could be deported, but he could not be deported to El Salvador. And that is exactly what the government did in March. And another thing that the government did in March, when they deported Mr. Abrego Garcia, they did so without due process, meaning he did not see a judge. He did not have an opportunity to contest whether or not he was an MS-13 gang member. He didn't have an opportunity to do anything before he was loaded onto a plane and sent to CCOT, which some people have described as a gulag. Now, when legal analysts such as myself were up in arms about this in March, the counter narrative was, why do you care about a dangerous gang member? Why do you want dangerous criminals inside the United States? To which I said, and what many legal analysts, lawyers said, that's beside the point. We're not saying we want dangerous criminals within the United States. What we are saying is that all persons are afforded due process of law. That is a constitutional right. And the Constitution does not say that this right is only conferred upon citizens of the United States. It's conferred upon everybody. And here's my issue, okay? People said, well, Donald Trump won the election on a platform of deporting as many, as they call, illegal aliens. Some call them undocumented individuals, but as many people who entered the country illegally as he possibly can. That might be true, but never once did the United States vote on a constitutional amendment to change the Constitution to suspend certain people's constitutional rights. The Constitution is our governing document. The United States is a constitutional republic. We are a democracy, but we're also a constitutional republic. What does that mean? That means that we are a country of laws and that our laws are governed by our Constitution. And so why am I talking about this now? Well, at the time of this recording, Mr. Kilmar Abrego Garcia has now been criminally charged. I have the indictment in front of me. He has been charged with 2 counts. One is a conspiracy to transport aliens. Those are foreign nationals. And the other is just transportation of those undocumented or of foreign nationals, undocumented people within the United States. And what the Department of Justice is alleging in this indictment is that not only is Mr. Abrego Garcia an MS-13 gang member, but that for many years, he was operating as a transport man for coyotes. And coyotes are people who bring in undocumented people illegally into the United States for money, and that he was picking them up in Texas and transporting them all around the United States. That is a fact. That is now the indictment. Okay. So before this indictment came, Mr. Abrego Garcia had been deported to El Salvador without due process. As we know, there were a lot of legal challenges mounted. His lawyer got involved and basically said to the court, hey, court, you can't just deport someone without due process. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And guess what? The Supreme Court, even though we have a conservative Supreme Court, they agreed and they told the government that they must facilitate Mr. Abrego Garcia's transport back to the United States. Why is that? That's because he was deported without due process. That's not because he should be staying in the United States. It's because he didn't have the opportunity to see a judge before he was deported. And that is the law of the land. If you don't like it, tough. That's what our Constitution says. If you want to change our Constitution, ratify a constitutional amendment, but they must facilitate his return. Okay, well, that put the Trump administration in a really bad spot because Attorney General Pam Bondi and a lot of other folks within the administration, they said he's never going to be back in U.S. soil. We don't want him back. Even the president of El Salvador made this big show in the Oval Office and made no sense, by the way, and said, oh, you want us to smuggle an illegal terrorist in the United States? Like, smuggle? If the United States is saying they want him back, you're not smuggling him. Like, it actually made no sense, and it was actually sad to see because it made no sense. But anyway, both sides said he ain't coming back. But that put the administration at odds with the usually friendly Supreme Court. And the administration continued to lose in a lower court where the case went back to because the judge kept saying, okay, what's the update on Mr. Abrego Garcia? And the government was tap dancing because they didn't have an update, but they had been ordered to facilitate his return. So what I think happened here is the government strategize to get themselves a win. And, a lot of times in legal cases, that's what you do. You sit around and you think, how can I deliver a win? How can I prevail in a really tough situation? They wanted to comply with the Supreme Court order. I know a lot of folks have been saying we're going to be up against a constitutional crisis because the Trump administration won't comply with court orders. But Donald Trump himself had said that he respects the Supreme Court and he was going to comply. So this put them in a really bad situation because it appeared that they were not complying with this order to bring his return. And that's where I think the Department of Justice came up with this idea for a win. Because if they charged Abrego Garcia and they officially were able to prove that he was an MS-13 gang member, well, then they could bring him back to the United States. And that means they could comply with what the Supreme Court said and bring him back to face charges. So then they could point and say, I told you so. He's an MS-13 gang member. He did all these terrible things. Bring him to trial, put him in jail, make him serve a sentence if he is convicted, and then ultimately deport him. So they get to lean into their narrative. He's a bad guy, but also comply with the Supreme Court order because then he's back in the United States. And that is exactly what they did because as of this recording, although so many people, the White House spokeswoman, the Attorney General said he would never come back to the United States, Mr. Abrego Garcia is now sitting in prison in Tennessee, waiting to be tried on these charges, this 2-count indictment. So a lot of people, Mr. Abrego Garcia's supporters are saying these are trumped up charges, pun intended, that the government just came up with these charges for the win. This is all political weaponization because a lot of this is stemming from a traffic stop of Mr. Abrego Garcia in Tennessee where they found, I think, 9 undocumented individuals in his car. He claimed that they are just coming from Missouri for work, although the government did some investigation now in the year 2025, and they found that car had not actually been in Missouri. But at the time, the government did not investigate. The government did not bring charges. The government is now bringing charges because they're under pressure. That is true. But now what I'm going to say is a little unpopular, and this is the prosecutor in me. While it is almost certainly true that the only reasons that charges have been brought is because there was this immense pressure and the government needed to find their win. So they issued this indictment. But it is an indictment. And I just want to remind people that for an indictment to be handed up, that means a grand jury must have listened to evidence. And a grand jury is U.S. citizens. They're not people from the Trump administration. They're people that have been called for jury service. And they sit in a big room and prosecutors come in and they present their evidence. Now, this for a grand jury indictment, The defense does not have an opportunity to be heard, usually. It's the government putting on their evidence, and then the grand jury has to find probable cause, and that is a low standard compared with beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. There's a joke that you can indict a ham sandwich because the burden of proof is so low. But the reality is some evidence must have been presented to that grand jury for them to hand up this indictment. So we know there's at least probable cause for these charges. But the important thing here is now Mr. Abrego Garcia is going to be afforded due process. That means he is going to have an opportunity to see a judge when facing these criminal charges. His lawyer is going to have an opportunity to attack these charges. His lawyer is going to be able to make the argument in a court that these charges should be dismissed, that they weren't rightfully brought, that the evidence is flimsy. He's going to have his day in court, and that judge is not going to be Donald Trump or the Trump administration. And people may say, well, what if it's a Trump-appointed judge? Let's wait until we get there. But regardless, his lawyer is going to have that opportunity, and he's going to have his case heard in front of a jury. And a jury is going to be full of 12 citizens that are just showing up for jury service, and they're going to swear an oath to evaluate the evidence and only convict if the government is able to prove these charges beyond a reasonable doubt. And the defense is going to have an opportunity to cross every government witness and put on their own evidence if they wish, and try to show that there is not enough evidence to convict Mr. Abrego Garcia. That is due process. And when the government finally moves to deport Mr. Abrego Garcia, they are going to be able to go in front of a judge and ask that withholding of removal to El Salvador be enforced so he cannot be sent to El Salvador. That is due process. Mr. Abrego Garcia is finally going to be afforded due process. And for many of us, that was the point. He needs to have his constitutional rights. And now that he is back on U.S. soil, he is going to be afforded them. And if ultimately the government is able to prove in front of a jury of 12, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he did the things that the government is alleging, then he's going to be rightfully convicted. Because again, most of this movement for Mr. Abrego Garcia was never really about the man. It was about the Constitution. And those of us, especially those of us who were prosecutors or held government jobs, we swore an oath to defend the Constitution against all threats, foreign and domestic, to abide by that Constitution. That is all we wanted to see. And now justice is going to be at work. And some people don't want to hear that. They're upset that this man is facing these charges. And once again, I say, and this may be unpopular, but I say, let's let the evidence come out in court. We must go through that effort because we have a constitution, because this is the rule of law that is the cornerstone of our democracy. And again, I say, if they are criminals and they are so dangerous, because that's the narrative, you have these dangerous, undocumented criminals running around the United States wreaking havoc, why aren't they being picked up and charged? This is the prosecutor in me. If you got gang members running our streets doing these bad things, charge them. Charge them. Charge them and put them and lock them in jail while they are waiting for their day in court. But they get their day in court. And so that is why Mr. Abrego Garcia's return to the United States to face a court is a win. It is a win for him too, because he gets to argue his case. Unpopular opinion, perhaps, but I argue to you, it is a good day for the rule of law. But please drop me a comment. Let me know how you feel about this situation. Let me know how you feel about these charges. Let me know how you feel about procedural due process. And as always, if you like what you heard here today, go ahead, click like and subscribe. And just remember to tell folks, at least you heard it here.